Hey, this is Pastor Tom. Thanks for joining me as we take a quick look at Ecclesiastes chapter 3. Verse 1 introduces a famous poem. For everything there is a season, and a time for every matter under heaven. I remember reading this as a young man, and I assumed that the contrasting pairs of time in verses 2 through 8 were a reflection on the breadth of human experience. I took it that I personally needed to know when to do each of these things. I needed to know when to weep and when to laugh, for example. But this week in your Digging Deeper exercise, I asked you to look at the relationship between God and time here in this chapter. Because verse 11 says, God has made everything beautiful in its time. There is more in this chapter on God's sovereign control over time. Make sure you look for what the preacher says in these verses. Verse 9 again brings up the very first question asked in Ecclesiastes 1, verse 3. What gain has a worker from his toil? By saying this, we are alerted to the fact that the preacher has not gone off on a different subject matter here in chapter 3. So how does this connect to the preacher's failures that he listed in chapter 2? In other words, how is chapter 3 connected to what went before? We'll need to explore that connection. After the preacher says, he has made everything beautiful in its time, he adds, also, he has put eternity into man's heart. And then he seems to give a contrast by using the word yet. Yet so that he, man, cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. What is this eternity in man's heart? And how does it relate to not understanding God's actions? Verse 12 says something very similar to chapter 2, verse 24 about eating and drinking and finding joy in toil. He says that this joy is God's gift to man, which picks up the idea of gift that was already mentioned in verse 10. Verses 14 through 15 are about God's unalterable plans. Whatever God does endures forever. And for the first time the word fear is used, so that people fear before him. Fear is a key word that comes up in the last chapter, where we are told that this book was written so that people might learn to fear God. Now so far in verses 1 through 15, the preacher has proclaimed that God is in control over all that happens. But in verse 16 he raises an objection. If God is in control, then what about injustice in the place of justice? Verse 17 gives an answer. God will judge. Then verse 18 gives a startling thesis. God is testing men so that they see they are but beasts. This is startling because verses 19 to 22 make it sound like death is the end of the matter, and that the preacher doesn't know if there's any way to know what happens after death. That's a problem for us to look into. Does the preacher not really know what happens after death? These are great questions to look into. We hope you'll join us this Sunday. God's blessings on your week.